Hey guys, tonight we're not talking about knights in shining armor or damsels in distress. No, we're diving headfirst into the muck, the grime, and the sheer, unadulterated misery of a profession that made even the dung collectors wrinkle their noses. We're talking about the medieval rat catcher, and trust me, it was even worse than you think. You've seen the paintings, maybe? Stern-looking fellows with pointy sticks and a determined terrier nipping at their heels. Looks almost quaint, doesn't it? A vital service, keeping the vermin down. Noble, even, in a grimy sort of way. Well, let me tell you, the reality was about as quaint as a boil on your backside during a jousting tournament. Being a medieval rat catcher wasn't just a job, it was a full-body immersion into the worst aspects of the era, a daily tango with disease, disgust, and death, all for the kind of pay that wouldn't keep a shrew in crumbs. So, before you drift off, maybe give that like button a gentle poke and consider subscribing, but only if you truly appreciate these little journeys into the less than glamorous corners of history. And drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from and time. It's always a strange comfort knowing others are awake in the wee hours, contemplating the horrors of historical hygiene. Now, take a deep breath, preferably of clean, modern air, and let's shuffle cautiously into the world of the medieval rat catcher. Prepare for smells you can almost taste and sights you'll wish you could unsee. Let's be honest, nobody chose to be a rat catcher. You didn't exactly sit down with your medieval guidance counselor, probably just a bewildered priest or your perpetually exhausted mother, and declare, "My dream is to spend my days wading through filth, battling legions of plague-ridden rodents." No, this wasn't a calling. It was more like a sentence. You were likely born into it, the family trade passed down like a hereditary cough. Or perhaps you were an orphan, scooped up by the village or town council and assigned the job nobody else would touch. Maybe you owed a debt, committed some minor infraction, or simply drew the shortest, most dung-encrusted straw. Whatever the path, it wasn't paved with ambition. It was more of a muddy slide into the societal sewer. Imagine your childhood. While other kids were learning valuable skills like, well, probably also unpleasant medieval skills like subsistence farming or dodging cartwheels, you were getting acquainted with the local rodent population. Your nursery rhymes weren't about fluffy sheep, they were cautionary tales about the rat that ate the baker's cat, your first pet, likely a half-starved ferret with questionable loyalty and teeth like tiny daggers, meant to be your future partner in grime. Your apprenticeship, if you could call it that, began the moment you could hold a stick without poking your own eye out. Forget learning letters or numbers. Your education involved identifying different types of rat droppings, a surprisingly nuanced field, apparently. Learning the subtle art of setting a snare that wouldn't just snap your own fingers off, and developing an immunity to smells that could curdle milk at 50 paces. Your mentor, likely your father or some grizzled veteran of the rat wars, wasn't exactly nurturing. Lessons were delivered through grunts, cuffs to the head, and the occasional demonstration involving a cornered rat and a heavy boot. "See that, lad?" he'd scream, pointing a dirt-caked finger towards a scurrying shadow. "That ain't just a pest. That's dinner. For the worms, if it bites you wrong." Inspiring stuff. You learn to move quietly, to anticipate the frantic scrabbling in the walls, to distinguish the squeak of a terrified rat from the squeak of a rusty door hinge, a crucial distinction, especially at night. Playtime involved chasing particularly bold rats out of the larder, or trying to train your mangy terrier not to eat the bait before the rats got to it. Your playground wasn't a sun-dappled meadow, it was the damp, lightless cellar of the local tavern, the narrow, refuse-choked alley behind the butcher shop, or the truly delightful confines of the town sewer. assuming your town was fancy enough to have one. You learned the geography of your world through its infestations. You knew which houses had the crumbliest foundations, which granaries were basically rodent buffets, and which nobles secretly had rat problems they'd pay handsomely, or more likely meagerly, to keep quiet. You became intimately familiar with the underbelly of society, quite literally. By the time you were 10, you probably had more scars from bites and scratches than freckles, and your primary scent was a unique blend of stale urine, damp earth, and existential dread. This wasn't just a job you were learning, it was an identity being forced upon you. You were becoming the rat boy, the vermin chaser, the guy people cross the street to avoid unless their house was actively being consumed by a tide of fur and teeth. Welcome to the profession. Hope you didn't have plans for, happiness or a long life. Chapter 2. Tools of the Trade, or Weapons of Mass Disappointment. Every profession has its tools. Blacksmiths have hammers, bakers have rolling pins, knights have swords. Rat catchers? Well, they had what could generously be described as pointy sticks and false hope. Let's start with the basics. Your primary weapon against the rodent hordes was likely a simple wooden club or stick. Not some finely crafted instrument of precision, mind you, but whatever chunk of wood you could find that wouldn't immediately splinter when swung at a particularly chunky rat. If you were lucky, maybe you'd have a metal tip or some nails hammered through the end, a medieval upgrade that turned your stick from laughably ineffective to occasionally lethal if you can actually hit something. Then there were the traps. Oh, the traps. Primitive contraptions of wood, metal, and bitter experience. The classic snap trap, essentially a medieval mousetrap, was a temperamental beast. Set it too loose, and the rat would happily feast on your bait before sauntering away to tell its friends about the free buffet. Set it too tight, and it would spring at the mere suggestion of a breeze, usually catching nothing but your own fingers when you tried to reset it. The number of rat catchers missing fingertips wasn't a coincidence. It was an occupational hazard. Cage traps were another option, assuming you wanted to collect live rats for reasons we'll get to later. These were essentially tiny prisons made of woven willow or, if you were particularly fancy, wire mesh. The principle was simple. Rat goes in, door falls, rat can't get out. The reality? Rat goes in, door sticks, rat invites friends. You now have a cozy rat dormitory rather than a trap. And let's not forget the bait. In theory, you'd use cheese, bread, or some other tempting morsel. In practice, you'd use whatever scraps you could scrounge that weren't already crawling with maggots. The rats weren't picky, but they weren't stupid either. They could smell a trap from across the room, which meant you were constantly trying to outsmart creatures that had survived everything from floods to famines to the occasional enthusiastic cook who mistook them for unusually athletic chickens. Your most valuable tool, however, wasn't something you could hold. It was something that could hold on to rats with remarkable enthusiasm. Your dog. Not some pampered lapdog or noble hunting hound, but a scrappy, battle-scarred terrier with a personal vendetta against anything with a tail longer than its leg. These dogs were the true heroes of the rat-catching world, diving into dark corners, squeezing into impossibly small spaces, and emerging triumphant with a mouthful of squirming rodent. Your relationship with this dog was complicated. On one hand, it was your most loyal companion, the only living creature that didn't look at you with a mixture of disgust and pity. On the other hand, it frequently smelled worse than you did, an impressive feat. Had a habit of bringing you presents at the most inopportune moments, and occasionally got so excited about its job that it would bite anything that moved, including your ankles. For the more sophisticated rat catcher, a phrase that's about as oxymoronic as pleasant plague, there were specialized tools like long-handled tongs, for grabbing rats in hard-to-reach places, leather gloves that provided approximately 3 seconds of protection before a determined rat chewed through them, and bags, endless bags, for collecting your grisly trophies. Speaking of bags, these weren't the sturdy, purpose-built sacks you might imagine. No, these were typically repurposed grain bags, old clothing sewn together with clumsy stitches, or, in truly desperate times, your own hat turned upside down. They leaked, they smelled, and they had an uncanny ability to develop holes precisely when you had them full of very angry, very alive rats. Then there was your attire, the rat catcher's uniform, if you will. No shining armour or impressive robes here. You wore whatever wouldn't immediately disintegrate upon contact with the filth you waded through daily. Patched trousers, a tunic that had seen better days, probably when your grandfather wore it, and boots, if you were lucky enough to have them, that squelched with every step from perpetual dampness. Some rat catchers wore masks, not out of any understanding of disease prevention, but simply because the smells they encountered daily would make a tanner's workshop seem like a field of lavender. Your final tool, and perhaps the most important, was your reputation. A good rat catcher was known not just for catching rats, but for being slightly mad, completely fearless, and immune to disgust. This wasn't a tool you could craft or buy. It was one you earned through countless bites, endless nights in dank cellars, and the peculiar 1,000-yard stare that developed after you'd seen a rat king. Multiple rats with their tails knotted together, forming a horrifying rodent bouquet. So there you have it, the rat catcher's arsenal. Not exactly the stuff of heroic ballads, was it? No gleaming swords, no mighty steeds, just sticks, traps, a questionably loyal dog, and the lingering scent of desperation. But in the right hands, usually gnarled, scarred hands missing at least one finger, these simple tools were all that stood between a town and complete rodent domination. And you thought your job was tough because the office coffee machine keeps breaking down. Dawn breaks over the medieval town. Birds chirp, bakers stoke their ovens, and somewhere in a damp, forgotten corner, you, the rat catcher, are already elbow deep in something unspeakable. While the rest of the world is just beginning to stir, you've been up since the small hours. Because rats, unlike their human neighbours, don't believe in sleeping in. Your day begins in darkness, not out of some professional dedication, but because rats are primarily nocturnal and catching them means adapting to their schedule. You rise from your straw mattress, likely infested with its own menagerie of tiny wildlife, in a home that's less a house and more a collection of walls that haven't completely surrendered to gravity yet. Your abode is typically on the outskirts of town, partly because it's all you can afford, but mostly because no one wants to live next to the person who comes home each day with a sack of dead rats. Breakfast is a hasty affair. Perhaps a chunk of stale bread, maybe some porridge if you're feeling particularly prosperous. You wash it down with ale, not because you're developing a medieval drinking problem, but because water is often more dangerous than the rats you hunt. Besides, a slight buzz helps dull the inevitable pain of the day ahead. You gather your tools, the sticks, the traps, the bags, and call for your dog, who's probably already quivering with anticipation. This isn't just a job for your canine companion, it's the highlight of its day. The same cannot be said for you. Your first stop is typically to check the traps you set the previous evening. This is a bit like a macabre version of Easter egg hunting, except instead of colourful eggs, you're looking for wooden contraptions that might contain very dead, or worse, very angry rats. You move through the town like a ghost, keeping to the shadows. Not for any dramatic effect, but because people tend to cross themselves and spit when they see you coming. The trap checking is a mixed bag. Some are empty, The bait stolen by rats clever enough to avoid the mechanism. Some have sprung but caught nothing, a frustrating waste of both bait and hope. And some, the successful ones, contain your quarry in various states of deceased. These you empty into your collection bag with practiced efficiency, resetting the trap with fresh bait for the next unsuspecting rodent. But traps are just the appetizer in your rat-catching feast. The main course is active hunting, and this is where your day really gets interesting. You have a mental map of the town's worst infestations. The granary with its endless supply of food, the tannery where rats feast on scraps of flesh, the tavern cellars where spilled ale creates a rodent paradise. You make your rounds, moving from hotspot to hotspot like a perverse pilgrimage. At each location, the routine is similar but uniquely awful. You enter, you listen for the telltale scratching, and then you and your dog spring into action. The dog dives into dark corners, behind barrels, under floorboards, flushing out the rats. You stand ready with your stick, your reflexes honed by years of practice and the occasional tetanus infection. The rats, for their part, don't go quietly. They squeak, they scurry, they fight back with surprising ferocity for creatures the size of a loaf of bread. They have teeth that can chew through wood and claws that can scale stone walls. They're fast, they're smart, and they have absolutely nothing to lose. Sometimes you catch them, sometimes they escape, and sometimes, more often than you'd like to admit, they turn the tables and catch a piece of you instead. Each bite is not just painful, it's a potential death sentence in an era before antibiotics or even a basic understanding of infection. Midday finds you knee-deep in some nobleman's cellar, or perhaps wading through the town midden, the medieval equivalent of a landfill, but with more human waste and fewer environmental regulations. The smell is indescribable, a potent cocktail of rot, excrement, and despair. But this is where the rats thrive, so this is where you must go. Lunch, if you can call it that, is eaten on the move. Maybe you've brought another piece of bread, now flavoured with whatever has rubbed off on your hands. Maybe a local housewife, grateful for your services but unwilling to invite you inside, hands you a bowl of something hot through a barely opened door. You eat standing up, one eye always on the lookout for movement. The afternoon drags on, a blur of dark spaces, sudden movements, and the occasional victory cry from your dog. You move from building to building, your reputation preceding you like a particularly pungent cloud. Children peek from windows, equal parts fascinated and horrified. Adults nod grimly, acknowledging your necessity, while silently thanking whatever deity they worship that they aren't you. As the sun begins to set, your bag grows heavier, filled with the day's catch. But your work isn't done. Evening brings a new phase, setting fresh traps for the night, placing them strategically in areas where you've noticed activity. Each trap is a small hope, a promise that tomorrow's haul might be a little better, a little easier. Finally, as true darkness falls, you make your way to the town square or the local lord's manor, whoever is paying for your services. Here, you empty your bag, counting out the day's catch for payment. It's a grim accounting, each rat worth a pittance, but it adds up if you've had a productive day. With your meagre earnings in hand, you might stop at the tavern, not the main room where the respectable folk drink, but the back corner or even outside, where they'll serve you, but won't have to look at you too closely. Here, you drink not to celebrate, but to forget, to numb the aches, to wash away the day's filth that no amount of actual washing ever seems to remove. Then it's home, to your isolated dwelling, to feed your dog, to tend to the day's new wounds, to fall into an exhausted sleep, only to do it all again when the cock crows. This is your routine, day after day, season after season. No weekends, no holidays, no respite. The rats don't take breaks, and neither can you. It's a relentless cycle of hunt and be hunted, a daily dance with creatures that outnumber you thousands to one. And the worst part? Despite your best efforts, you know you're fighting a losing battle. For every rat you catch, dozens more are born. You're not solving the problem, you're just keeping it at bay, a single finger in a crumbling dam. But you keep at it, because what else can you do? In the medieval world, once you're the rat catcher, that's all you'll ever be. Sweet dreams, everyone. Let's talk about workplace safety, shall we? In the modern world, we have OSHA regulations, safety equipment, and those delightfully passive-aggressive signs counting days since the last accident. Medieval rat catchers had, well, they had the comfort of knowing that when they inevitably succumbed to some horrific ailment, at least they wouldn't have to catch rats anymore. The health hazards of rat catching weren't just numerous, they were practically guaranteed. Let's start with the most obvious, the rats themselves. These weren't your modern fancy pet store rats with their glossy fur and adorable whiskers. Medieval rats were walking, squeaking disease vectors, carrying everything from fleas to literal plague. Yes, the Black Death, that cheery pandemic that wiped out roughly a third of Europe's population, was primarily spread by fleas that lived on rats. So while everyone else was desperately trying to avoid anything rat-adjacent, you were actively seeking them out, handling them, and essentially inviting their disease-ridden companions to hop aboard your person. It was like being a medieval cruise director for the bubonic plague. But it wasn't just plague. Rats carried a veritable buffet of bacterial and viral delights. Typhus, salmonella, Weil's disease, rat bite fever. Yes, that's its actual name. Medieval medicine wasn't big on creative nomenclature. Each rat was a potential death sentence wrapped in fur, and you were collecting them by the dozen. Then there were the bites and scratches. Rats don't go quietly into that good night. They fight back with impressive ferocity. Their teeth can slice through flesh with disturbing ease, and those claws, while tiny, are remarkably effective at leaving lasting souvenirs on your skin. Each wound was a doorway for infection in an era when antibiotics would have sounded like some exotic foreign dish. Infection was a constant companion. Your hands, perpetually covered in small cuts and scratches, were regularly plunged into environments that would make a modern biohazard team suit up like they were walking on the moon. Sewers, middens, cesspits, all places where rats thrived and where human immune systems went to die. The resulting infections ranged from the merely painful to the spectacularly fatal. Tetanus was a particular favourite. One wrong step, one rusty nail or sharp piece of metal hidden in the muck, and you'd find yourself with locked jaws and muscles spasming so hard they could break your own bones. They called it lockjaw back then, and it was essentially a death sentence delivered with exquisite, prolonged agony. But it wasn't just acute injuries and infections you had to worry about. The long-term health effects of the job were equally delightful. Let's consider your respiratory system, shall we? You spent your days in dank, mouldy environments, breathing in a cocktail of dust, animal dander, mould spores, and whatever noxious gases were produced by decomposing, well, everything. The result? Chronic respiratory issues that would make a chain smoker wince in sympathy. Your lungs became a playground for everything from pneumonia to tuberculosis, with a side of chronic bronchitis just to keep things interesting. That persistent cough. It wasn't just annoying, it was your body's desperate attempt to expel the medieval equivalent of industrial pollution. Your skin fared no better. Constant exposure to filth, parasites, and the various fluids involved in your work led to an impressive array of rashes, lesions, and conditions that would baffle modern dermatologists. Fungal infections flourished in the perpetually damp conditions of your clothing and boots. Your skin became a patchwork of scars, calluses, and mysterious eruptions that itched, burned, or oozed depending on their mood that day. Let's not forget the parasites. Fleas were just the beginning. Lice made their home in your hair and clothing, ticks found the warm crevices of your body irresistible, and various intestinal worms considered your digestive tract prime real estate. You weren't just a rat catcher, you were a walking ecosystem. Mental health? That wasn't even a concept yet, but if it had been, you'd have been a case study. The constant stress of the job, the social isolation, the knowledge that you were one bite away from a gruesome death, it all took a toll. Add in the sleep deprivation from working odd hours and the general discomfort of, well, everything about your existence, and you had a recipe for what modern psychologists might gently term significant psychological distress. Your diet didn't help matters. Poverty and social standing limited your food options to whatever was cheapest and most filling. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries, and your protein came from the questionable cuts that no one else wanted. Nutritional deficiencies were as much a part of your life as your trusty rat stick, leading to problems from scurvy to night blindness to bones that broke easier than a nobleman's promise. Alcohol became both medicine and coping mechanism. It dulled the pain, killed some germs, or so you believed, and made the reality of your existence slightly more bearable. The line between medicinal use and dependency blurred quickly, adding liver damage to your impressive collection of health issues. Your life expectancy. Let's just say you weren't likely to worry about retirement planning. Most rat catchers didn't see old age, not because they found lucrative second careers and retired to country estates, but because something in their professional portfolio of risks finally cashed in. Those who did survive into their later years were walking catalogues of chronic conditions, their bodies as bent and broken as the tools of their trade. The truly ironic part. Despite being surrounded by death and disease daily, you probably had a better understanding of hygiene than many of your contemporaries. You knew, from bitter experience, that there was a connection between filth and illness. You washed more frequently than was common, which admittedly was a low bar to clear. You kept your living space cleaner than might be expected, and you developed rituals and practices to minimize your risks. Not that it helped much. In the grand medieval lottery of mortality, you'd bought all the wrong tickets. Every day was a gamble, every rat a potential harbinger of doom, every wound a possible final chapter. And yet, you persisted because someone had to do the job, and that someone, through luck or curse or simple lack of alternatives, was you. So the next time you complain about your paper cuts or office chair-induced back pain, spare a thought for the medieval rat catcher whose workplace hazards included literal plague and whose safety equipment consisted primarily of try not to get bitten too badly. Now, who's ready for dinner? In the grand hierarchy of medieval society, there was a place for everyone, kings at the top, nobles just below, knights, clergy, merchants, craftsmen, peasants, and then, somewhere far below the peasants, possibly sharing space with the earthworms, there was you, the rat catcher. Social status in medieval times wasn't just about wealth or power, it was about cleanliness, respectability, and not being associated with things that made people involuntarily gag. On all these fronts, you failed spectacularly. Your profession wasn't just lowly, it was actively repulsive to pretty much everyone who wasn't currently being overrun by rodents. Let's consider how people reacted to your presence in various social situations. Walking through the market, vendors suddenly remembered urgent business on the opposite side of their stalls. Entering the tavern, conversations died faster than rats in a cat convention. Passing by a group of children, their mothers hurriedly gathered them up like you were carrying visible clouds of plague, which, to be fair, you might have been. You were a walking reminder of everything medieval society tried to ignore: the filth, the vermin, the diseases lurking just beneath the surface of daily life. In a world obsessed with spiritual purity and increasingly concerned with physical cleanliness, by medieval standards anyway, you were the embodiment of impurity. You didn't just work with filth in the public eye, you were the filth. Church was a particularly awkward experience. Religion dominated medieval life, and the church was the center of community activity. But when you shuffled in, still reeking from the morning's work, people didn't just move away. They practically teleported to the opposite side of the building. The priest might preach about charity and loving thy neighbour, but that theological generosity rarely extended to letting the rat catcher sit nearby. You'd think that providing an essential service would earn you some respect. After all, without you, the town would be overrun with disease-carrying rodents in a matter of weeks. But gratitude is a funny thing. People were thankful for your services in the abstract, but wanted nothing to do with you in person. It was the medieval equivalent of loving sanitation, but avoiding eye contact with the garbage collector. Marriage prospects? Let's just say your romantic options were severely limited. Parents didn't exactly dream of their daughter bringing home a rat catcher. "Oh, he has such steady employment," they wouldn't say. "And just think of all the dead rats he'll provide for our grandchildren." No, if you managed to find a spouse, they were likely from a similarly low social stratum, perhaps the child of another rat catcher, keeping the family business alive, or someone with so few options that your steady, if disgusting, income looked like security. Your living situation reflected your social standing. You didn't live in the heart of town among the respectable folk. Your home was on the outskirts, possibly near the tanneries, slaughterhouses, or other smelly industries where your own aroma wouldn't stand out quite so dramatically. Your neighbours were likely other undesirables: the knacker who disposed of dead animals, the night soil collector, perhaps the occasional suspected witch. Even your clothing marked you as an outsider. While medieval fashion wasn't exactly diverse, there was still a clear visual hierarchy, and you were at the bottom of it. Your clothes were practical, durable, and perpetually stained with substances best left unidentified. You didn't wear the bright colours or fine fabrics of the wealthy, nor even the simple but clean garments of ordinary peasants. Your wardrobe was functional at best, horrifying at worst, and always identifiable from a distance, which was precisely how everyone preferred to identify you. Legal standing? Technically, you had rights, but in practice, your word carried about as much weight as a feather in a hurricane. If accused of a crime, your profession alone was practically evidence of guilt. Who would believe the rat catcher over literally anyone else? You existed in a strange limbo, necessary enough to be tolerated but reviled enough to be perpetually suspect. The truly ironic part was that despite being a social pariah, you were also privy to the secrets of the town in ways few others were. You entered homes and businesses that would never invite you socially. You saw the rat infestations in the supposedly immaculate manor house, the vermin scurrying through the monastery kitchens, the rodent nests in the merchant storage rooms. You knew which buildings were rotting from the inside, which cellars flooded regularly, which granaries were one whisker away from total infestation. You were like a medieval private investigator with the worst beat imaginable. You knew things, not because anyone told you, but because rats went everywhere, and so did you. This knowledge gave you a small, bitter kind of power, not enough to improve your standing, but enough to occasionally negotiate better payment when a particularly wealthy client was desperate to keep their rat problem quiet. Children were simultaneously fascinated and terrified by you. To them, you were a boogeyman made flesh, the scary figure parents invoked when they wanted compliance. Eat your porridge, or the rat catcher will take you away. But you were also exciting, dangerous, mysterious. They might follow you at a safe distance, daring each other to get closer, to touch your bag, to peek at its grisly contents. Their parents, of course, were horrified by this interest and would drag them away, shooting you looks that suggested you were somehow deliberately luring their precious offspring toward a life of rodent-based depravity. Holidays and festivals brought your social isolation into sharp relief. While the rest of the town celebrated, danced, feasted, and temporarily forgot the hardships of medieval life, you remained on the periphery. The rats didn't take holidays after all. In fact, with more food waste and general chaos, festivals were prime rat time. So while others made merry, you worked, circling the edges of the celebration like a ghost at a wedding. If you did join in, you were kept at arm's length, or preferably several arms' lengths. You might be allowed to watch the maypole dancing, but not participate. You could listen to the minstrels from the back of the crowd. You could purchase ale from the tavern, but you'd drink it outside, not at a table with others. Your presence was a reminder of the unpleasant realities everyone was trying to escape, if only for a day. The few people who did interact with you willingly were usually those with their own social challenges. The town drunk, the suspected witch, the old soldier with too many stories and too few teeth. Together, you formed a sort of shadow community, the people who existed on the fringes, necessary but unwanted. Over time, you might develop a certain pride in your outsider status, not because it was pleasant, but because it was yours. You weren't just any social outcast, you were the rat catcher. You had a skill, however revolting. You served a purpose, however thankless. In a world where most people were defined by their birth, their family, their guild, you were defined by your ability to do what no one else would. And on rare occasions, very rare, when rats overran a granary or invaded the Lord's manor in numbers too great to ignore, you experienced a brief, shining moment of importance. Suddenly, people remembered your name. The same villagers who crossed the street to avoid you now sought you out. The Lord who never acknowledged your existence now promised payment, perhaps even a bonus. For a fleeting moment, you weren't just tolerated, you were needed. Then the crisis passed, the rats retreated, and so did your social capital. You returned to your place at the bottom of the hierarchy, carrying your bag of dead rodents and whatever scraps of dignity you'd managed to salvage. So, the next time you feel socially awkward at a party, remember, at least you're not the medieval rat catcher whose very approach could clear a room faster than someone announcing free beer in the opposite direction. Let's talk about the financial rewards of rat catching, a topic that can be covered almost as quickly as a medieval rat catcher could spend their daily earnings, which is to say, instantly and with a lingering sense of disappointment. In the grand economic ecosystem of the medieval world, rat catchers occupied a peculiar niche. Your services were essential. Nobody wanted to live in a rat-infested hellscape. but your compensation reflected society's desire to interact with you as little as possible, including financially. Payment structures varied depending on where and when you plied your trade, but they generally fell into a few categories, none of which would have impressed a medieval financial advisor. Not that those existed, but if they had, they'd have told you to reconsider your career choices. The most common payment method was the per-rat system. Simple, straightforward, and brutally efficient. You were paid a small sum for each rat you caught and presented as proof. This system had the advantage of being performance-based, catch more rats, earn more money, but it came with its own special set of problems. First, there was the issue of proof. You couldn't just tell the town bailiff or local lord that you'd caught 30 rats that day. No, you had to show them, which meant carrying around a sack of dead rodents like the world's most disturbing delivery service. Some localities required only the tails as proof, which was marginally less revolting, but still meant you spent your days collecting rat appendages like a deranged collector. The per-rat payment was typically a pittance, a few pennies at most, often less. The exact amount might be set by local custom, the whim of whoever was paying, or how desperately they wanted their rat problem solved. During normal times, you might earn just enough to subsist. During plague outbreaks or other rat-related crises, your rates could temporarily skyrocket, making you briefly, fleetingly, almost not poor. Some rat catchers worked on a retainer system, especially in larger towns or for wealthy estates. You'd be paid a fixed sum regularly to keep the rat population under control. This had the advantage of providing steady income but came with the expectation of results. If rats started appearing in the Lord's dining hall or the monastery's grain stores, your retainer could vanish faster than a rat down a drain pipe. Then there was payment in kind, the medieval equivalent of exposure for modern freelancers, except instead of exposure, you got turnips. A farmer might offer you a portion of the grain you helped protect. A baker might provide bread. A brewer might share ale. This wasn't entirely worthless. You did need to eat after all, but try paying your rent in slightly mouldy turnips and see how far that gets you. Speaking of housing, your living arrangements were directly tied to your meagre earnings. Rat catchers typically couldn't afford proper homes within town walls. You might live in a shack on the outskirts, a converted shed, or if you were particularly unfortunate, a repurposed pigsty. An upgrade for the pigs, a lateral move for you. Your furniture would be minimal, your comforts few, your roof questionably waterproof. Some rat catchers were provided housing as part of their compensation, especially if they worked primarily for a castle, monastery, or large estate. This might sound like a perk until you realized that your housing was often a closet-sized room near the midden heap, the stables, or some other appropriately malodorous location that matched your social standing and personal bouquet. The economics of rat catching extended beyond simple payment. You had expenses, not many, granted, but they existed. Your traps needed maintenance. Your clothes, such as they were, needed occasional replacement. Your dog needed feeding. These costs ate into your already meager earnings, ensuring that financial security remained as elusive as a particularly clever rat. Your economic status affected every aspect of your life. Your diet was whatever you could afford, which meant a lot of porridge, occasional vegetables, meat only when you were lucky or desperate enough to eat what you caught. Yes, some rat catchers did eat rats in hard times. Protein is protein when you're starving. Your clothing was patched and repatched until it was more patch than original garment. Luxuries. The concept would have made you laugh if laughter hadn't been replaced by a chronic cough years ago. Medical care was another expense you simply couldn't afford. When you were injured, and you were injured frequently, You relied on home remedies, questionable poultices, and the healing power of dirt. A serious injury or illness could end not just your career, but your life, as you had no savings to sustain you through recovery and no social safety net beyond perhaps the grudging charity of the church. Retirement wasn't a concept that applied to your profession. You worked until you couldn't, and then you died, usually sooner rather than later. There was no pension, no gold watch, or bronze one, or even a tin one, no farewell feast. Old rat catchers didn't fade away into comfortable dotage, they just faded away, period. The truly perverse aspect of your financial situation was that your income was directly tied to the problem you were trying to solve. If you were too effective at eliminating rats, you effectively eliminated your own livelihood. This created a perverse incentive that some unscrupulous rat catchers gave into, deliberately maintaining a certain rat population to ensure steady work. It was medieval job security at its most morally questionable. Taxation added insult to injury. Yes, even as a rat catcher, you weren't exempt from the complex web of medieval taxation. You might pay in coin, in kind, or in service, but the Lord, the Church, and possibly the town all took their cut of your meagre earnings. The irony that you paid taxes despite being barely able to feed yourself was probably not lost on you, though your complaints would have fallen on deaf, unsympathetic ears. Seasonal fluctuations hit your income hard. Rats bred more prolifically in certain seasons, particularly after harvests when food was plentiful. Winter might see a surge as the rodents sought shelter indoors. These boom times were offset by periods when work was scarcer, creating a feast or famine cycle that made financial planning, not that you had the education for such a concept, virtually impossible. Competition could further erode your earning potential. In larger towns, you might not be the only rat catcher, and the resulting competition drove prices down. Travelling rat catchers, often charlatans with fancy clothes and fancier promises, might sweep through periodically, stealing your business with grand claims before disappearing with their payment, leaving the rats and the problem behind for you to deal with. The social stigma attached to your profession limited your ability to supplement your income through other means. No one was hiring the rat catcher as a part-time anything if it involved human interaction. Your side hustles, if you had any, were likely as unsavory as your main gig. Perhaps night soil collection, grave digging, or other jobs that kept you firmly at the bottom of the social and economic ladder. There were rare exceptions to this bleak financial picture. A particularly skilled rat catcher in a rat-plagued city might achieve a modest prosperity. Those who developed specialized techniques or tools might command higher rates. A rat catcher who saved a noble's storehouse or prevented an outbreak might receive a one-time reward that briefly lifted them above subsistence level. But for most in the profession, the financial reality was grim. You worked constantly, earned barely enough to survive, and had nothing to show for it but scars, chronic ailments, and the dubious satisfaction of knowing that without you, things would be even worse. So the next time you grumble about your paycheck, remember the medieval rat catcher for whom minimum wage would have seemed like unimaginable wealth, and whose retirement plan consisted entirely of try not to die too painfully when you can no longer work. Now, who's ready to check their bank account balance? Let's delve into the professional techniques of the medieval rat catcher, a collection of methods that somehow managed to be simultaneously primitive, ingenious, disgusting, and occasionally effective. This wasn't just a job, it was a dark art, passed down through generations of increasingly hunched and bite-scarred practitioners. First, we need to understand your quarry, Medieval rats weren't the relatively docile creatures you might find in a modern pet store. These were battle-hardened survivors, evolutionary champions that had thrived alongside humans for centuries despite our best efforts to eradicate them. They were smart, adaptable, and reproduced at a rate that made rabbits look celibate. A female rat could produce up to 5 litters a year, with each litter containing up to a dozen pups. Do the math, and you'll understand why rat catching was less a career and more an exercise in futility. But still, you persisted, armed with techniques that ranged from the surprisingly sophisticated to the dear God, why? Let's start with tracking. Before you could catch rats, you needed to find them, and this required developing an almost supernatural awareness of rat signs. You became fluent in the language of droppings. Their size, freshness, and concentration told you not just that rats were present, but how many, how big, and how recently they'd passed through. You could spot the subtle signs of rat activity that others missed, the faint grease marks along walls where their fur repeatedly brushed, the barely visible gnaw marks on wooden beams, the almost imperceptible scratching sounds that differentiated a rat from the settling of an old building. You learned to think like a rat, to understand their habits and preferences. You knew they preferred to travel along walls rather than open spaces, that they were creatures of habit who created regular pathways, that they were neophobic, suspicious of new objects in their environment. This knowledge informed your strategy, turning what might seem like random placement of traps into a calculated campaign. The simplest and most direct method of rat catching was, of course, hunting. Armed with your stick, club, or other improvised weapon, you'd flush rats from their hiding places and attempt to dispatch them directly. This was less a refined technique and more a frantic whack-a-mole game, except the moles fought back and occasionally carried plague. Your dog was your most valuable ally in this hunt. Certain breeds, particularly terriers, were bred specifically for their rat-catching abilities. These dogs had the speed to catch rats, the tenacity to pursue them into tight spaces, and the jaw strength to kill them instantly. A good rat dog was worth its weight in gold. Not that you'd ever see that much gold in your lifetime. The relationship between rat catcher and dog was symbiotic. You flushed the rats out, the dog caught them. The dog drove rats toward your traps. You protected the dog from particularly vicious rodents. Together, you formed a rat-catching unit more effective than either could be alone. Your dog might have been the only living creature that didn't look at you with disgust, which probably explained why many rat catchers were more attached to their canine partners than to any human. Trapping was your other primary technique, and medieval rat traps came in a surprising variety. The basic snap trap, a spring-loaded bar that broke the rat's neck or back when triggered, was a staple. These needed to be baited with something tempting enough to overcome the rat's natural caution. Cheese is the bait we associate with rat traps today, but medieval rat catchers knew that rats preferred foods high in protein and fat. Meat scraps, fish heads, or even nut butters were often more effective. Cage traps allowed for catching rats alive, which might seem counterintuitive. Why would you want a live rat? But had several advantages. Live rats could be sold for certain purposes, more on that disturbing topic shortly. And a cage full of squeaking, panicked rats could actually attract more rats through their distress calls, creating a grisly domino effect. Pit traps were another option, essentially deep containers with smooth sides that rats could fall into but not climb out of. These might be baited or placed strategically along known rat pathways. The classic version was a bucket with a ramp leading up to its rim, baited in the center, with the surface covered by a material that would give way under the rat's weight. The medieval version of this might use a ceramic pot or wooden bucket, with the trap door being a piece of parchment or thin cloth. Glue traps, surfaces coated with sticky substances that would immobilize rats, existed in primitive forms. Tree sap, boiled down pine resin, or other naturally sticky substances could be spread on boards or shallow dishes. These were particularly cruel, as the rats didn't die quickly, but instead slowly starved while stuck to the surface. Even by medieval standards, this was considered somewhat harsh, though not enough to prevent their use. Water traps were another common method. These typically consisted of a container of water with a baited platform positioned above it. When the rat attempted to reach the bait, the platform would tip or rotate, dropping the rat into the water where it would drown. The medieval version might be as simple as a half-filled bucket with a precariously balanced stick across the top, baited in the middle. For larger infestations, smoke was sometimes employed, by blocking all exits from a space except one, and then introducing smoke, usually by burning damp straw or other materials that produced thick smoke without much flame. You could drive rats toward the remaining exit, where you and your dog would be waiting. This was particularly useful for clearing ships, granaries, or other enclosed spaces with severe infestations. Poison was a controversial technique, even in medieval times. The most common rat poisons were arsenic-based compounds, which were effective but presented obvious dangers to humans, pets, and livestock. As a rat catcher, you might use poison selectively, particularly in areas where other methods were impractical, but you did so knowing that you risked killing more than just rats. The line between rat catcher and poisoner was thin, and crossing it could lead to suspicion, or worse if livestock or, God forbid, people fell ill after your visit. Some rat catchers employed ferrets, domesticated polecats with a natural instinct for hunting rats. These slender, flexible predators could pursue rats into their burrows and tunnels, places even the most dedicated dog couldn't reach. Working with ferrets required skill and patience. They weren't as trainable as dogs and had a tendency to disappear into wall spaces for hours or even days at a time. Then there were the more esoteric methods. Some rat catchers claimed to use charms, spells, or special whistles that could lure rats. The most famous example is, of course, the Pied Piper of Hamelin, whose story, whether based on a real rat catcher or purely legendary, reflects both the desperation of rat-infested towns and the mysterious, almost magical status sometimes attributed to particularly successful rat catchers. The reality behind these magical methods was usually more practical. A rat catcher might use scent trails, oils, or other strong-smelling substances to lead rats toward traps or away from certain areas. They might exploit the rat's natural behaviors, such as their tendency to follow established paths or their wariness of open spaces. What looked like magic to observers was often just a deep, practical understanding of rat psychology. Live rats caught in your traps weren't always immediately dispatched. They might be sold for various purposes. Some medicinal, rat oil was believed to cure baldness, among other dubious claims. Some recreational rat baiting, where dogs were set against rats in a pit, was a popular blood sport. And some scientific, early anatomists sometimes used rats for dissection. This added a grisly side hustle to your main profession. Your techniques evolved with experience. Each failure taught you something new about rat behavior. Each success reinforced what worked. You developed a sixth sense for where rats would be, how they would move, what would attract or repel them. This wasn't book learning. There were no manuals for rat catching, but a physical, intuitive knowledge passed from master to apprentice, refined through years of trial and error. The most successful rat catchers combined multiple methods, adapting their approach to the specific situation. A warehouse infestation might call for traps and dogs, while a noble's manor might require more discreet methods. A ship in port needed to be cleared quickly before sailing, while a chronic infestation in a granary might require a longer-term strategy. What united all these techniques was their fundamentally reactive nature. Medieval rat catching was never about prevention. Concepts like proper food storage, building construction that limited rat access, or systematic waste management were either unknown or impractical. You weren't solving the rat problem. You were merely keeping it at bay, fighting a perpetual battle against an enemy that bred faster than you could kill them. And perhaps that was the most depressing aspect of your techniques, not their primitive nature or occasional brutality, but the knowledge that no matter how skilled you became, no matter how many rats you caught, there would always be more. Your techniques weren't a path to victory. They were simply the tools of an endless, unwinnable war. So the next time you set a modern, humane trap for the occasional mouse that finds its way into your home, spare a thought for the medieval rat catcher, armed with nothing but sticks, dogs, and desperate ingenuity against a literally overwhelming enemy. Now, who's hungry? In the cutthroat world of medieval rat catching, you might think your biggest competition would be other rat catchers. After all, how many people could possibly be fighting for the prestigious title of person who touches dead rats for a living? As it turns out, more than you'd expect, and they were just the beginning of your competitive woes. Let's start with your human rivals. In smaller villages, you might be the only rat catcher, not because the position was so coveted that they limited it to one lucky individual, but because no one else was desperate or deranged enough to take the job. In larger towns and cities, however, multiple rat catchers might operate, creating a veritable turf war of traps, dogs, and increasingly creative claims about rat-catching prowess. Competition among rat catchers wasn't like competition among, say, bakers or blacksmiths. There were no guilds setting standards, no apprenticeship systems ensuring quality, no regulations governing practice. It was a free-for-all, with territory often determined by who got there first, who had the most effective methods, or simply who was intimidating enough to make others back off. Territorial disputes could get ugly. Finding your carefully placed traps moved, damaged, or stolen was common. Your rival might spread rumours about your methods or results, claiming you were ineffective, or worse, that you actually brought rats with you to ensure future employment. Physical confrontations weren't unheard of. Two rat catchers meeting in a dark alley might exchange more than just professional courtesies, especially if one felt the other was encroaching on their established territory. But your human competitors were just the beginning. You also faced competition from nature's own rat catchers. Cats. These smug, self-cleaning predators did essentially the same job you did, but with significantly more social acceptance. No one crossed the street to avoid a cat. No one refused to let a cat sit at their table. Cats were welcomed into homes, given cream, and praised for their hunting skills, while you, doing the exact same service, were treated like you carried the plague, which, to be fair, you might have. The relationship between rat catchers and cats was complicated. On one hand, they were competition, potentially reducing the rat population enough to affect your livelihood. On the other hand, they could never completely eliminate a rat problem. Rats bred too quickly and were too clever, so there was always work left for you. Some rat catchers even incorporated cats into their methods, using them to flush rats from hiding places or to guard grain stores between visits. But cats had limitations. They couldn't set traps, couldn't access all the spaces rats inhabited, and were, frankly, too independent to be reliable employees. They caught rats when they felt like it, not on any human schedule. They also tended to bring their prey as gifts to their human companions, which, while effective as a demonstration of their hunting prowess, did little to systematically address an infestation. Beyond cats, you faced competition from other predators. Owls silently hunted rats in the night, snakes slithered into their burrows, and even certain types of hawks would prey on rats foolish enough to venture into open areas during daylight. These natural predators were both allies and competitors, reducing the rat population but also potentially reducing your income. Then there were the charlatans, travelling rat catchers who were long on promises and short on actual rat catching ability. These con artists would sweep into town with grand claims about their special techniques, magical abilities, or secret formulas guaranteed to rid any building of rats forever. They'd charge exorbitant fees up front, perform some theatrical but ultimately useless ritual, and be gone before anyone realised the rats were still very much in residence. These frauds gave legitimate rat catchers a bad name, or rather, a worse name than you already had. After a town had been duped by a charismatic charlatan, they'd be suspicious of all rat catchers, including you with your practical methods and realistic expectations. You'd have to work twice as hard to prove your worth, often for less pay, because the town's rat-catching budget had been exhausted by the fraud. The most famous of these charlatans, of course, was the Pied Piper of Hamelin, whose story, whether based on a real incident or purely legendary, reflected the desperation of rat-infested towns and their vulnerability to those who promised miraculous solutions. For actual rat catchers, the piper was both an aspiration, imagine being paid in gold rather than pennies, and a frustration, setting unrealistic expectations about what rat catching could achieve. But perhaps your greatest competition came not from other rat catchers, cats or charlatans, but from the rats themselves. These weren't passive victims waiting to be caught. They were active participants in an evolutionary arms race, constantly adapting to your methods. Rats are incredibly intelligent for their size, with problem-solving abilities that would put some humans to shame. They learned to avoid traps after seeing other rats caught. They developed wariness of new objects in their environment, neophobia, making baited traps less effective. They communicated danger to each other through squeaks and scent markers. They could squeeze through holes the size of a quarter, climb vertical surfaces, swim for days, and survive falls that would kill larger animals. Their reproductive rate was your other great challenge. A single female rat could produce up to 50 offspring in a year, and those offspring could begin reproducing at just 5 weeks of age. The math was not in your favour. Even if you caught dozens of rats daily, you were barely making a dent in the population. Environmental factors created additional challenges. Weather affected both rat behaviour and your ability to catch them. Heavy rains might flood their burrows, driving them into buildings in greater numbers, but also making your work more miserable as you slogged through mud and water. Extreme cold might kill some rats, but drive others deeper into human habitations, making them harder to access. Extreme heat could make working conditions unbearable, especially in enclosed spaces like attics or cellars. Seasonal changes in food availability also impacted rat behaviour. After harvest, when grain was being stored, rat populations would boom. During lean times, they'd become more desperate and potentially more aggressive, making them both easier to bait and more dangerous to handle. The physical environment presented its own challenges. Medieval buildings weren't exactly constructed with pest control in mind. Thatched roofs provided perfect nesting sites. Wattle and daub walls offered countless entry points. Stone buildings had gaps and crevices where rats could hide. Dirt floors allowed for burrowing. Every structure was essentially a rat condominium waiting to happen. Urban density compounded the problem. In crowded medieval towns, buildings were packed tightly together, often sharing walls, allowing rats to move from one structure to another without ever going outside. Narrow streets and alleys provided protected pathways. Open sewers and middens offered both food sources and highways for rat travel. Public health understanding, or lack thereof, created another challenge. The connection between rats, fleas, and disease wasn't understood. Waste management was primitive at best, creating ideal conditions for rat populations to thrive. Your job was made infinitely harder by the very conditions of medieval life, which essentially rolled out the welcome mat for your quarry. Authority figures could be as much hindrance as help. Local officials might demand immediate results without providing adequate resources. Nobles might expect their estates to be completely rat-free, an impossible standard, while balking at paying what the service was worth. The church might view excessive rat populations as divine punishment, making your practical approach seem almost blasphemous. And let's not forget the psychological challenges. The constant exposure to filth, disease, and death took a toll. The social isolation wore you down. The knowledge that despite your best efforts, you were fighting a losing battle could lead to a sense of futility that was hard to shake. Yet despite all these competitors and challenges, you persisted. Because someone had to do it. Because it was the only skill you had. Because even a rat catcher's meager income was better than nothing. You adapted your methods, learned from your failures, celebrated your small victories, and kept going, one rat at a time. In the grand competition of medieval life, you weren't winning any prizes, but you were surviving. And in a world where plague, famine, and violence were constant threats, sometimes survival was victory enough. Now, who's ready for some more uplifting content? If you thought rat catching was merely a terrible profession that maintained a consistent level of awfulness year-round, I have disappointing news for you. Like a fine wine that's been left open too long, rat catching had distinct seasonal variations, each with its own unique bouquet of misery. Let's start with spring, that lovely time of year when flowers bloom, birds sing, and rats emerge from their winter hideaways with a singular focus on making more rats. Spring was essentially rat dating season, and they were not particularly selective about their romantic partners. The result? A population explosion that would make even the most dedicated Malthusian scholar weep. For you, the rat catcher, spring meant a sudden increase in work as property owners noticed the uptick in rodent activity. The winter-starved rats were bolder, more visible, and frantically searching for food to support their growing families. This made them somewhat easier to catch, but dramatically increased their numbers. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Just as you made progress in one area, 3 more would report infestations. Spring rains added another layer of joy to your work. Medieval drainage systems, where they existed at all, were primitive at best. Heavy spring showers turned streets into muddy rivers and lower levels of buildings into impromptu ponds. Guess who got flooded out of their burrows and homes? That's right, rats. And guess where they went? Anywhere dry, which usually meant higher up in buildings, making your job more difficult and dangerous as you balanced on rain-slick roof beams or navigated waterlogged cellars where drowning became a legitimate occupational hazard. The mud was its own special torment. Your already difficult movement from location to location became a slog through ankle-deep muck that seemed specifically designed to suck the shoes, if you were fortunate enough to have them, right off your feet. Your dog, normally your most reliable ally, would return from each pursuit covered in so much mud that you could barely tell which end was which. The traps you so carefully set would be buried or washed away, and the bait rendered useless by the constant damp. Spring also brought renewed activity in fields and gardens, disturbing rat nests that had remained hidden through the winter. Farmers ploughing fields would unwittingly displace entire rat colonies, sending them scurrying toward the nearest buildings, usually just as you'd finished clearing those buildings of their winter residents. It was like a never-ending game of rodent musical chairs, except the music never stopped, and you were always the one left standing. Summer brought its own special brand of rat-catching hell. The heat turned every enclosed space, attics, storerooms, shipholds, into sweltering chambers that could rival a baker's oven. You, already dressed in whatever layers of patched clothing you owned, would be expected to crawl into these spaces and remain there for hours, hunting rats while essentially being slow roasted alive. The smell, always a notable feature of your profession, reached new heights in summer. Decomposition accelerated in the heat, meaning any rats that died in inaccessible spaces, and there were always some, would announce their presence with an odour that could strip paint off walls. Your own personal aroma, never exactly reminiscent of a flower garden, became so potent in the summer heat that even you might notice it. A truly remarkable achievement given your desensitized olfactory system. Summer also meant increased human activity, which complicated your work. Markets were busier, streets more crowded, buildings more occupied. Trying to discreetly set traps or hunt rats with your dog became nearly impossible when curious onlookers were everywhere. Children, freed from whatever passed for education and with time on their hands, would follow you around, making noise that scared away your quarry, or, worse, interfering with your traps out of misguided curiosity. The increased food waste of summer, all those fruit rinds, vegetable trimmings, and meat scraps tossed into streets and middens, created a rat paradise. More food meant healthier rats, which meant more breeding, which meant more rats. It was a vicious cycle that kept you employed, but also ensured you could never actually get ahead of the problem. Insects added another layer of torment. Flies, mosquitoes, and various biting creatures seemed to find you particularly delicious, perhaps because of the unique cocktail of scents you carried. Working in dark, damp spaces meant spiders became unwelcome companions, dropping onto your face at inopportune moments, or weaving webs that you'd walk through, leaving you frantically swatting at your face and looking even more deranged than usual. Autumn brought harvest time, and with it, a rat population that had been growing all summer suddenly found itself with access to unprecedented food resources. Granaries, storehouses, and root cellars were filled to capacity, creating all-you-can-eat buffets for your rodent adversaries. Your services were in high demand, but the pressure was immense. A failed harvest due to rat damage could mean starvation for an entire community. The stakes were highest in autumn, and so was the scrutiny. Every rat you missed was potentially meals lost for a family. Every grain store you failed to adequately protect became a mark against you. The pay might be slightly better during this critical time, but the stress was exponentially higher. Autumn also meant preparation for winter, which for rats translated to finding secure, warm places to nest. They became more aggressive in their efforts to enter buildings, chewing through anything in their way. Your job shifted from merely catching rats to also identifying and blocking entry points, a nearly impossible task given medieval construction techniques that seemed designed specifically to provide rat highways into every structure. The shortening days of autumn meant more of your work took place in darkness. Candles and lanterns were expensive luxuries you could rarely afford, so you worked by touch more than sight, feeling your way through dark spaces, never quite sure if what you were about to grab was a rat, a spider, or something even less pleasant. And then came winter, when you might think rat activity would decrease, giving you a well-deserved break. You would be wrong. Rats didn't hibernate. They simply concentrated their activities in and around human habitations where food and warmth could be found. The cold drove them indoors in even greater numbers, making infestations more noticeable and your services more in demand. Winter conditions made your already difficult job nearly impossible. Frozen ground meant rats couldn't burrow outdoors, focusing all their activity inside buildings. Snow and ice made travelling between locations treacherous. Your hands, already scarred and calloused, cracked painfully in the cold, making the delicate work of setting traps an exercise in agony. Your dog, if not properly cared for, and let's be honest, you could barely care for yourself, suffered in the cold. Wet paws on frozen ground, icy water in its fur, the constant shift between the freezing outdoors and the relative warmth of indoor spaces all took a toll on your canine partner's health and effectiveness. Winter also meant people spent more time indoors, crowded into whatever heated spaces were available. This put them in closer proximity to rats, making infestations more noticeable and complaints more frequent. It also meant you were working in occupied spaces more often, trying to catch rats while navigating around people who simultaneously wanted the rats gone but didn't want to see or acknowledge the process that made that happen. The reduced food supply of winter made rats more desperate and potentially more dangerous. Hungry rats would take greater risks, attack food sources more aggressively, and fight back more fiercely when cornered. Your already hazardous job became even more dangerous as you dealt with rodents that had nothing to lose. Winter illnesses compounded your misery. The cold, damp conditions, combined with your perpetual exhaustion and poor nutrition, made you susceptible to whatever diseases were circulating. A simple cold could become pneumonia. A minor wound could fester in the damp conditions, and unlike those with more respectable professions, you couldn't simply take time off to recover. No work meant no pay, and no pay meant no food or shelter. The truly perverse aspect of your seasonal challenges was that they created a never-ending cycle of work that prevented any real progress. Spring's breeding led to summer's population growth, which led to autumn's harvest invasions, which led to winter's concentrated infestations, which positioned the rats perfectly for spring breeding again. You weren't solving a problem, you were merely managing a perpetual crisis, season after season, year after year. Weather extremes of any kind created additional complications. Floods drove rats to higher ground, often into human living spaces. Droughts concentrated both rats and humans around limited water sources, creating new infestation patterns. Storms damaged buildings, creating new entry points for your adversaries. There was no perfect weather for rat catching, only variations of challenging, more challenging, and why am I even trying? Through it all, you adapted as best you could. You learned which baits worked better in which seasons, how rat behaviour changed with the weather, where to look for nests during different times of year. You developed a calendar of sorts, not marked by holidays or festivals, but by rat breeding cycles, harvest times, and weather patterns that would affect your work. This knowledge was your only real advantage, passed down from rat catcher to rat catcher, refined through bitter experience. It didn't make the job pleasant or even significantly easier, but it made it possible, and in the harsh reality of medieval existence, possible was often the best you could hope for. So the next time you complain about seasonal allergies or having to shovel your driveway, remember the medieval rat catcher for whom every season brought new and creative ways to make an already miserable profession even worse. Now, who's looking forward to spring? History books don't exactly overflow with glowing tributes to rat catchers. You won't find marble statues of men with rat-catching sticks standing proudly in town squares, or elaborate tapestries depicting the heroic battle between a rat catcher and a particularly chunky rodent. Medieval chroniclers, with their focus on kings, battles, and miracles, rarely spared a sentence for the humble rat catcher. And yet, your grimy, thankless profession shaped history in ways that continue to echo through the centuries. Let's start with the most dramatic impact: disease control. The connection between rats and disease wasn't scientifically understood in medieval times, but the correlation was sometimes observed. Towns with effective rat catchers often suffered less from certain outbreaks, particularly bubonic plague. You didn't know you were fighting Yersinia pestis bacteria carried by rat fleas. You just knew you were catching rats. But in doing so, you were unwittingly on the front lines of medieval public health. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, killing an estimated 1/3 of the population, was primarily spread by rats and their fleas. While rat catchers couldn't prevent the pandemic, the scale was simply too vast and the understanding of disease transmission too limited. Areas with established rat control sometimes fared marginally better. You were fighting a war you didn't even know you were in, with weapons that were laughably inadequate, but fighting nonetheless. Beyond plague, rats spread numerous other diseases: typhus, salmonellosis, leptospirosis, rat bite fever. Every rat you removed from the human environment potentially prevented illness or death. You were, in essence, a medieval public health worker, operating without recognition, scientific understanding, or proper compensation. Your impact extended beyond disease control to food security. In an era where famine was a constant threat and food storage technology was primitive, protecting grain stores from rats was literally a matter of life and death. A successful harvest could be devastated by rats within weeks if left unprotected. By keeping rat populations in check around granaries, storehouses, and food markets, you helped ensure that more of the limited food supply actually fed humans rather than rodents. Consider the math. A single rat can consume about 30 grams of food per day and contaminate 10 times that amount with urine, feces, and hair. A moderate infestation of 100 rats, not uncommon in a medieval granary, could destroy or contaminate over 100 kilograms of food per month. In a subsistence economy where margins between survival and starvation were razor thin, this could mean the difference between a community making it through winter or not. Your work also contributed to economic stability in ways that went unrecognized. Rats damaged more than just food. They chewed through textiles, leather goods, wooden structures, and pretty much anything else they could get their teeth on. By limiting rat damage to goods and infrastructure, you helped preserve economic assets and reduce maintenance costs, allowing limited resources to be directed elsewhere. Ships were particularly vulnerable to rat damage. Rats would chew through ropes, damage cargo, and even gnaw on wooden hulls, potentially compromising vessel integrity. A rat-free ship was a safer, more reliable trading vessel. Your services at ports, ensuring ships departed with minimal rat populations, contributed to safer maritime trade, the lifeblood of medieval commerce. The psychological impact of your work shouldn't be underestimated either. Rats have always inspired a particular kind of revulsion and fear in humans. A visible rat infestation created anxiety, disgust, and a sense of disorder. By removing rats from human spaces, you provided not just practical benefits, but also peace of mind, allowing people to sleep without the sound of scratching in the walls or the fear of rats running across their faces in the night. Your profession also contributed to the development of certain technologies and methods that would evolve over time. The traps, poisons, and techniques used by medieval rat catchers were early forms of pest control that would eventually develop into more sophisticated systems. Your empirical trial and error approach to finding what worked laid groundwork for later, more scientific methods. The relationship between humans and certain dog breeds was shaped by rat catching. Terriers, in particular, were bred and trained specifically for their rat-catching abilities. The bond between rat catcher and dog represented one of the earliest professional human-animal partnerships, predating many of the working dog roles we recognize today. In literature and folklore, the rat catcher became an archetype, a liminal figure who dealt with the unclean and dangerous, who moved between worlds, who was both necessary and reviled. The most famous literary rat catcher, the Pied Piper of Hamelin, emerged from this tradition. Whether based on a real incident or purely legendary, the story captured something essential about how society viewed your profession: powerful, somewhat mysterious, necessary, but not to be trusted. The Pied Piper tale also reflected a truth about your social position. You were needed, but not valued, called upon in crisis, but discarded afterward. The story's dark ending, with the children of Hamelin being led away after the town refused to pay the piper, can be read as a warning about the consequences of not properly valuing essential but unpleasant work. Your profession even influenced language. Phrases like rat race, smelling a rat, like rats deserting a sinking ship, and rat someone out, all derive from observations of rat behavior and our complex relationship with these rodents. The very concept of the rat as a metaphor for betrayal or dishonesty has shaped how we think and talk about human behavior. Architecturally, the need to control rats influenced certain design elements. Rat walls, raised foundations, metal barriers on ropes and cables, and other rat-proofing features became standard in some structures. These practical adaptations, developed through bitter experience with rat infestations, subtly shaped the built environment in ways that persist in some forms today. The medieval rat catcher's experience also contributed to early understandings of ecology and population dynamics, even if these weren't formalized as scientific concepts. You observed firsthand how rat populations responded to food availability, weather conditions, predation pressure, and control efforts. This practical knowledge, passed from one generation to the next, represented an early form of ecological understanding based on direct observation rather than theory. Perhaps most significantly, your profession stood at a crucial intersection of human development, the point where humans began to actively manage their environment rather than simply responding to it. Rat catching wasn't just about eliminating a nuisance, it was about asserting control over living spaces, about defining what belonged in human habitation and what didn't. It represented an early form of environmental management that would eventually expand to encompass broader concepts of public health and urban planning. Your legacy lives on in modern pest control professionals who still battle many of the same adversaries you faced, albeit with better understanding, technology, and working conditions. The fundamental challenge remains the same: managing the boundary between human spaces and the natural world, protecting resources and preventing disease. So while history may have forgotten your name, while no monuments were built to commemorate your work, your impact echoes through time. Every granary that didn't collapse from rat damage, every family that didn't lose a child to rat-borne disease, every ship that completed its journey safely, these were your monuments, invisible but real. In the grand narrative of human progress, the humble rat-catcher played a role far more significant than contemporary society recognized. You stood at the intersection of public health, food security, economic stability, and the human relationship with the natural world. Your work was a necessary foundation upon which more visible achievements could be built. Not that any of this made your daily existence any less miserable, of course. Historical significance is cold comfort when you're knee-deep in a sewer, covered in bites, and socially ostracized. But perhaps, just perhaps, there's some satisfaction in knowing that centuries later someone would recognize that your suffering actually mattered. Now, who's ready for a slightly more uplifting conclusion? No? Just more rat content? Well, all right then. Now about appreciating your rat-free modern existence. We've journeyed together through the delightful world of medieval rat catching, from the moment you were unwillingly thrust into the profession, through the daily grind of chasing rodents through filth, to the surprising historical impact your miserable existence actually had. And if there's one thing I hope you've taken away from this soot-stained, flea-bitten journey, it's a profound appreciation for whatever job you currently have. Because let's be honest, no matter how bad your Monday morning meeting is, at least you're not waking up to find a rat has chewed through your only pair of shoes while you slept in a room that smells perpetually of damp fur and desperation. No matter how demanding your boss might be, at least they're not expecting you to produce a sack of dead rodents by sundown. No matter how underappreciated you feel, at least people don't cross the street to avoid you. Unless they do, in which case you might want to reconsider your personal hygiene strategy. The medieval rat catcher existed at a unique intersection of necessity and revulsion. You provided an essential service that literally kept society functioning, yet were rewarded with social ostracism, poverty, and an early, disease-ridden death. It's almost as if medieval society collectively decided, we need this job done, but we're going to make it so awful that only those with absolutely no other options will do it. And then, to add insult to injury, they didn't even bother to record your contributions for posterity. But perhaps there's something oddly inspiring about the rat catcher's plight. In a world of meaningless jobs and questionable contributions to society, the rat catcher's purpose was crystal clear. You weren't shuffling papers or creating PowerPoint presentations that would be forgotten by next week. You were engaged in a primal, essential task, protecting human food and health from one of our oldest adversaries. There was a brutal honesty to your work that's often lacking in our sanitized modern existence. Of course, that philosophical perspective probably wouldn't have provided much comfort as you pulled your umpteenth dead rat from a trap, your hands bleeding from fresh bites, your lungs burning from the miasma of whatever cesspit you were currently exploring. Philosophy is cold comfort when you're knee-deep in medieval sewage. The rat catcher's story is also a reminder of how far we've come in terms of public health, working conditions, and social safety nets. The problems you faced, disease, vermin, sanitation, haven't disappeared, but we've developed systems, technologies, and professions to address them in ways that don't require individuals to sacrifice their health, dignity, and lives quite so completely. Modern pest control professionals still battle many of the same adversaries, but they do so with protective equipment, scientific understanding, regulated chemicals, and salaries that actually allow them to live above subsistence level. They don't have to carry sacks of dead rats through town to prove they've done their job. They aren't social pariahs. They get weekends off and probably even dental insurance. So as we close this grimy chapter of medieval professional life, perhaps we should raise a glass, preferably not one that's been anywhere near a medieval rat catcher, to those unnamed, unsung heroes who kept our ancestors' grain stores just a little safer, their homes just a little less infested, their chances of surviving to adulthood just a little higher. They didn't get parades or monuments, but their impact ripples through history nonetheless. And the next time you spot a mouse in your kitchen and react with disgust or fear, remember that your medieval ancestors would have given their left arm, possibly literally given the infection rates of rat bites, for the luxury of dealing with just one rodent in an otherwise clean home. Your momentary inconvenience was their lifelong nightmare. Sleep well tonight in your rat-free bedroom, with your uncontaminated food safely stored in sealed containers, your body not covered in rat-inflicted wounds, your social standing not determined by your proximity to rodents. Sleep well, and perhaps spare a thought for the medieval rat catcher whose miserable existence helped make your comfortable one possible. And if you do hear scratching in the walls, well, there's always the phone number for a modern pest control service who will arrive in a clean uniform with effective tools and without a single plague-carrying flea hitchhiking on their person. Progress, my friends. Sweet, rat-free progress.